All right. We are live, which is to say we are recording, which is to say, I guess we are not live as the listener is listening, but it's great to be here with you, Chuck, and I very much appreciate these discussion sessions. And we are in the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology, and I'm being blessed by this in so many ways. Some of the ways are edifying in the sense that lots of things that I wouldn't have thought of are being brought up. So I am being enriched reading these chapters. Many things are coming to light that I would consider more polemically or more critically. That is to say, I would put myself outside of the community space of these authors speaking in these chapters, looking in, maybe offering something that I think is better from the Reformed tradition. And then there's a third aspect of this where, if I can say it generously, this is the quandary. And I think it comes to light in this chapter as much as anywhere else. And I don't mean this in the big red button pushing sense. I don't mean this in the bony finger pointing sense. We're reading these chapters together. And I'm wondering, Chuck, am I reading a post-Christian systematic theology? And that's a little bit too much. However, there were some issues that came up in this chapter that really were striking to me, because I think from our understanding, our Reformed tradition, we have some very specific ideas about worship, and the contrast and the distinction between an Orthodox Reformed position and what is being talked about in this chapter. This is one of the most strikingly different chapters, is what I'm trying to say. And so I didn't mean to prime the discussion by calling people's faith into question or orthodoxy. I just wish to say that this is awfully different in the perspective in this chapter, and I was struck by that. And without meaning to push you down that path, how was it when you were reading this and the issues were coming up? What were the things that were going through your mind and some first reactions?
As I was reading, it's interesting that it's pretty clear that the language that we're speaking is a little bit different. When we talk about worship in my church, or more generally in a Reformed community, there's different language that we use. And so one of the struggles that I had at first was just simply trying to do a little bit of translation. There's also a sense in which when you do that you have to spend some time trying to think about, okay, am I being fair in how I'm translating? Am I really translating properly, which you're using? And then the other issue is just simply when you speak a different language, there are just often different ways that you talk about it. And so there was just some things that Spinks, the writer Brian Spinks, talked about that just were, okay, I've got to think through this. I'm trying to think through what is it that he's really saying, and what does it mean, and are there implications further down? That said, I will say there were some things that I appreciated reading about, simply because I know that at least in my very specific tradition in the Christian Reformed Church in North America, we've been talking about worship and liturgy because, as many churches have been going through, we've been going through what some people call the worship wars, right? Where there's people argue about what's appropriate in worship and what kind of music should we be using and those kinds of. In my particular congregation's case, it's also in light of what can we do as a very small congregation that doesn't always have the assets that we once had, both as far as people with particular skills and the money to hire people if we didn't have them. And so we've been thinking about worship from that practical space as well. So today, for example, we were talking a little bit before we started recording that at my church, I led the worship, preached the sermon, and led the service, and gave my pastor a break for this week, a vacation week. And in doing that, it was a little difficult because I'll a lot of times pick music, but I knew we weren't going to have any live musicians, nobody playing piano, nobody playing guitar, anything like that. And so it was all going to be canned music that's been recorded somewhere, and you have to find some that's legal to use to start with, and then also that's appropriate for worship, because you don't want to just play the latest Christian contemporary worship tune and expect the congregation to sing along to it. And that is a difficult thing to do. And so we've been thinking in sort of those practical ways too about means. That all that's to say that there were still things that I very much appreciated. I enjoyed sort of thinking about issues of how does worship form us, which I think is a little bit, it's maybe a broader question than Spinks was getting at. I think in light of the fact that these chapters that we've been reading, starting with Revelation and moving to Scripture and then moving to tradition and now to worship, are, I think they were written specifically to get at the sources for our doctrines and sources for our dogma. But there is a sense in which, whether or not we agree that worship becomes a source of our doctrines and our dogma, it does, the way that we worship does affect how we believe. It impacts. There is he cites the title of a book, Praying Shapes Believing, or more specifically, giving a description, cult precedes creed and gives rise to it. And gives rise to it, excuse me, I don't know so much about that, but it does shape us. Worship does shape us, and we do have to consider those issues as we whether we're just people going to a worship service, as we prepare for worship, as we participate in worship, or if we're people who are involved in preparing worship, as we do that, as we design liturgies, as we think about the various elements of worship and what goes where, and what do we do from week to week. Those are issues that I think are worth at least consideration, even if we won't go quite so far as to say that the way that we worship is a source that we can trust in and of itself for shaping our creeds, rather than forming us because of the way that we use scripture. And yeah, it certainly, I appreciated the reading this week and agree with you that there were some things in there that occasionally you have to read a few times to kind of, what is he saying? What does he really mean by that? Is he using language that I just don't understand or not? And to be fair to him, what are some of the implications of what he's saying?
That's a great overview. And having started the discussion session with a big stick and threatening to swing it, let me walk back from the precipice a little bit. So, reading this chapter, as I have felt reading other chapters, I really got a strong question. Who is being worshiped? For whom is worship being tailored? And that guiding question gnaws at me as I'm reading this chapter. Now, there are some possibilities that I have to first throw out. So the first possibility is that Professor Spinks, writing this chapter on worship, is writing as a professional among professionals, just as, for example, a civil engineer might prepare something about the topic of civil engineering for other civil engineers, or a doctor might present something for an audience of other doctors. In that case, it's not necessarily a foul for the civil engineer to not reference the absolute basics of civil engineering, with the understanding that he's reaching out to a trained audience. And this is already common knowledge. This is already a given, as it were. And the same thing, too, with the doctor presenting. The idea is that if a doctor is presenting on a technical subject to another group of physicians, you maybe don't need to mention or cover basics that were appropriate in the first year of medical school. So that could be influencing the tone and the audience for this chapter and for other chapters in this systematic theology. Having said that, there's such a difference between treatments about worship and the proper way to worship God in this chapter and treatments that I've read from the Reformed tradition that I really have to wonder if we're talking about the same religion. And let me be careful, because I'm starting to swing a big stick. There's another possibility here before I swing the big stick. There's another possibility that could be happening, and that is that the writers of other chapters, as well as the writer of this chapter, Professor Spinks, could be shooting for a mere Christianity type approach, a sort of minimalistic, basic Christianity, because the idea of this systematic theology is to provide something that's relevant, meaningful, and insightful for a largely ecumenical audience. So we talked about the professional audience. The other idea here is that this is being written to have a broad ecumenical appeal. So the professor does seem to be taking pains to talk about Western Protestantism, as well as issues related to Roman Catholicism as well as issues that are relevant for the Eastern Orthodox Church. And in general, there does seem to be an effort here to be culturally aware, let's put it that way. So those are two possibilities that are noble and generous. And so maybe I should hold off on swinging the big stick here. And I really crave your feedback here to see if if I just have an itch to swing the big stick. So having said that, there's a concern here. When I'm reading Reformed treatments, I'm so struck by the burrowing into the scriptures, first of all. And then second of all, this guiding question, this regulative principle of worship. And I just mentioned RPW, this regulative principle, and that has a particular technical sense. I think something a little more generic than what most Calvinists mean when they talk about the RPW. But I think it's encapsulated in this idea that God determines the nature of worship. And I think my question is this chapter about cultivating a frame of worship that is acceptable to the largest stage or audience of people? Or is this chapter about trying to cultivate what is acceptable to God, with the proviso that perhaps the author is trying to do both? But having said that, this seemed to be the kind of chapter that I would expect to find in a post-Christian systematic theology, sort of measuring what Christianity might be with respect to, of course, our Reformed tradition. Maybe that's fair, maybe that's not fair. Would love to have that discussion, but I think that was my big question here reading this is, who are we pleasing with this chapter? And it doesn't mean that the generous options I mentioned might actually be at play here, but I sure would have loved to have seen a little bit more Godward worship driven issues being raised. And I think, like I said, with the Reformed treatments as a great contrast. So Chuck, I hope I'm not standing over the edge of a precipice. I hope I'm not taking Professor Spinks too far, and not just this professor in this chapter, but I feel the other authors in the other chapters are possibly at this place. And throwing it over to you, I still think we can read this chapter and the other chapters and get something profitable by it. But I just wondered, am I properly parsing this? Am I sensing this? Or maybe it's overstated. Maybe there's something else in play. So let me throw that over for some reflections.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate that. I think that even if we take that most generous option and see this chapter as primarily written to an audience of experts or to an audience of folks who are on a wide ecumenical scale, when you do that, you have made decisions that can impact even those further issues that you've talked about. So I think it's entirely possible to be very generous. In fact, I think your first option is probably a good, it's maybe not the only option, because I think the ecumenical issue certainly plays a role here. But I do certainly get the impression that the way that this is written, the language that's used, is very much the language of someone who is an expert in liturgy. And it does say that he is a professor of Christian liturgy at Yale University. And it's the kind of writing that experts in liturgical issues might write to each other. And so there are certain assumptions that are being made about what people understand and what people know. However, even when you make those choices and you feel that there is no longer the importance to bring in the basics, there's always the possibility that some of those basics get lost and that you dive down these chipmunk holes and get really deep into, I say chipmunk holes because I've got little chipmunks with me as I speak, but you run down these little chipmunk holes and you get involved in little things and little branches in different places, and you get so deep that you lose the sun. You're down underground. And I think that can happen. And by the way, I don't think that's a unique thing to simply people who are writing on worship or people who are writing on theology. I think it can happen in any subject. It reminds me a little bit, though, of the story that I think I told a couple of times of my good friend in high school, whose father was a theology professor at a Reformed Church in America college, and would occasionally go with his father to theology. And Reformed Church in America, being for many years tried to straddle the line its East Coast iteration tended to be somewhat more mainline, and its Midwest version tended to be more evangelical, more closer to a confessional reform denomination, and always trying to balance that a little bit. And so he would go to conferences on both sides of that line. And my friend would say, I go to a lot of these conferences with my dad, and I sometimes wonder whether any of these theologians actually are believers. And some of that is natural, I think, when you get so deep into particular issues, the minutia. So I think that is a danger. I also think that, as I mentioned, that there is a part here where this is being written to an ecumenical audience. I think a couple of these chapters, it's been very clear that there has been, even though I think most of these folks come from a generally Protestant, perhaps a generally mainline Protestant way of thinking, that there has been a real attempt to engage, especially Roman Catholicism, but also to a lesser extent, more so in this chapter, Eastern Orthodox. And when one is dealing with that ecumenical audience, you are likely to either avoid some of the divisive issues or the issues that can be seen as divisive, or gloss those issues over. And for example, you mentioned the RPW, the regulative principle of worship. That the regulative principle of worship is not a majority view in Christianity. You go to Catholics, you go to mainline Protestants, you go to Lutherans, you go to most evangelical Protestants. The RPW does not play a role at all in the way they think about worship, or if it does so in a very minimal way. And even in the Reformed community, there are differences on how that might play a role. In my own denomination, I think very clearly the Heidelberg Catechism spells out the regulative principle of worship, but how it's played out has been somewhat more broad than in some of the more conservative, especially Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian descending versions of denominations. And so my friends who might attend an Orthodox Presbyterian church would find certain things that we even do in my own church to be, I don't know, that might be crossing the line. And so there are different kinds of discussions. And so because of that RPW becomes this minority view. You and I would agree that, I think we would agree that it's the proper view, and we would more want to talk about how do we interpret that and what does it mean, and what is God allow in his worship, and what does he command us to do. But when that's a minority view, it's probably going to get shoved to the side, worship at a more ecumenical level. And because of that, a lot of things that you and I are going to be either considered very important, or even areas where we know that there's some level of discussion going on in the Reformed community about what exactly does this mean. Those things to us are fairly central. And before I was talking a little bit about my own congregation, some of the things that we've been thinking about and how to do worship. And practically speaking, this chapter is not going to be all that helpful to us because we're not an ecumenical audience. We are an audience of a small congregation within the Dutch Reformed tradition that has ways of thinking about how we do worship and wants to interpret those and think about whether this new thing that we're doing, is appropriate? And that's not the point of this chapter. And so in some ways, I think, yes, this chapter, for those of us in the Reformed tradition, because it includes such a much broader way of thinking about things, it's not going to be particularly helpful on those specific issues. And again, that said, there are still, as you noted, there are some things in this chapter that were helpful to come to understand, to think about. I found some of the discussion of culture and the role of culture in worship, and some of those questions. Those are questions that I think within the Reformed tradition need to be asked as well, but they can be asked in the light of more what Reformed doctrine says about worship and how we do worship and who is being worshiped and what does he demand as far as worship. I think there's also, as I mentioned, the interesting discussion of what does it mean that praying shapes believing, and what does that say to us? I think those are some important things to think about. And then even just a little bit, some of his questions about modern worship and postmodern worship, and what does that mean? And is there a golden age of worship, or are we looking for using our knowledge of worship to author and evolve worship which retains the transcendent, speaks of the other, and engages the present age? Now, we might use somewhat different language than he does there, but that question, I think, is still a valuable one to ask. So all that being said is, yes, I think you're on the right track with some of your criticisms here. I think even with a more generous reading of the reason this was written and the way this was written and the audience that it was written, it's fair to say that even when we do that more generously, it still leads to concerns as to how much you wouldn't use this chapter, for example. I wouldn't take this chapter and go to my worship committee at my church and say, hey, guys, you guys are meeting in 3 weeks. Why don't you read this chapter in preparation? And we'll talk about what this means for what we do every Sunday. That's just not it. That's not going to be particularly helpful in that regard. But I may take some of the things that I learned out of here and discussed out of here, and I might talk with them about some of those. Talk about, hey, if praying shapes believing, how do we look at what we're doing in this service? How do we look at possible changes to an order of worship and that kind of thing to make sure that we're doing what worships God the best and which leads the worshiper to a proper understanding of who God is and how he is.
So true. There's another potential category that is a more generous assessment for this chapter that I want to acknowledge, and that is the idea that the professor could be describing worship with respect to its historical development. And we see Herman Bavinck doing this all the time. In fact, for you and I have both privately stated that one of the reasons why we love Herman Bavinck's theology, his dogmatics, is because so much of it is grounded in not only a statement of the normative principles, which is ultimately what a systematic theology is about, but not only does Bavinck state the normative principles, but he discusses their formation, their history, their origin, the development. He talks about the side channels, the turns and twists that the doctrines have taken through history. And if Professor Spinks is doing that, then I think that's a noble thing. There's an interesting set of statements in this chapter that makes me think ultimately that's not happening, though. And I wanted to share that with you and share that with the listeners. And that is, you and I have been beating the drums with the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment, with the turn to self, the turn to the subjective, the turn to the anthropic center. Think here of Schleiermacher, think here of Kierkegaard, think here of Gadamer, Ricoeur. And what we have is we see a movement away from the age of faith, the age of the out-theredness of theology that was characterized so much by the classic creeds and confessions in the Reformed tradition, and instead a move toward this new subjectivism, this new phenomenalism of modern thought, which places the inner human situation at the center. And here's some text from the chapter. So in one space on page 381, the professor says, worship something which is to be done or performed. He then says, a written or printed text is always only a score awaiting performance. Therefore, terminology and grids from anthropological ritual study have been pressed into service in attempts to give further clarity. He then says this, performance theory, be it from theater or linguistic theory, has furthered understanding. And then later he talks about Habermas's theory of communicative action, which is built around this metaphor of intersubjectivity. Theology proposes an interpretive rather than instrumental understanding of things like sacraments. And then finally, he cites Christian Eucharists like Garrigan to suggest a radical intersubjectivity as a key contemporary way of speaking of God. And that is very interesting to me. Grammar is failing me here. Language is not set in stone. So the following statement can sound unqualified and harsh. And I don't mean it in that fashion. I'm just struggling for a better label at this point. But this approach almost sounds to me like a Christian Marxism, for lack of a better word. And I think of my Christian secularists, and I see a lot in common here. And that is really interesting. That is a big surprise that a systematic theology should be, with respect to worship, should be anthropologically driven. Because if one can acknowledge there's a role for the anthropological to play in the life of the church. But if there's one place where a systematic has to be not primarily anthropological, not performance driven, not theater, it's in the area of worship. And one of the things I was looking for and expecting was I was expecting maybe some discussion of the stakes involved. And in here, I was thinking about the unfortunate tragedy and situation in Leviticus chapter 10 here. And so let me just read a few verses. So this is set in the nation of Israel has just come out of Egypt in the Exodus. The Aaronic priesthood, that is to say, Moses' brother Aaron is the high priest, serving God and serving as priest for the people of Israel to God in this context. And so there's the sacrificial system, there's the system of offerings, we have the beginnings of the tabernacle of the holies, we have what's eventually going to develop into the temple worship later in the time of David. And so in Leviticus 10, we have an interesting situation. And it says this, starting at verse 1. Aaron's son, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense. And they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses then said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke of when he said, 'Among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored.'" And so it's very striking to me. I was not expecting a reformed style treatment of worship, but yet I was at least expecting the stake to be considered. And in not dealing with that, I have to wonder, does the professor's audience think that if they get some aspect of their worship wrong next Sunday, the difference is between them losing audience members or fire coming out from the presence of the Lord and consuming them? And without trying to gauge things that are not directly stated from the text, I didn't get a sense that it was the latter in reading this. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to commend a more reformed approach to this treatment. Now, having said that, what might be going on here? And what am I contrasting with this with? So I'm talking about a reformed approach. And what does that mean? Let me find okay. Of course, I just closed my file and have to go look for it again. So I'm going to look for it while we're bouncing back, Chuck. But I just wanted to further develop there and say that there's something really crucial at stake that I would have loved to see. And I enjoyed the historical overview that the professor did bring. Don't get me wrong. And I even enjoyed the comparison and the contrasting with some of the Christian socialism, Christian Marxism. Again, I'm searching for the right word. I suspect it's a post-Christian Christianity. Maybe the better word is a postmodern Christianity, because I know there's loaded connotations with these words and they represent accusations. But that's why I was so drawn by this. So let me throw it over to you for some follow-up with that.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments there. And that particular section that you cited about text being a little more than a script, that did catch my attention there. And certainly there's place for studying worship and looking at different worship traditions from the outside to see what is the meaning of that worship and how does it relate to other things going on in that worship community and things going on in the history of that worship community. But such a study is less about what are the doctrines, what is the theology of worship, and rather more about taking a look after we've set out what the theology of worship and what's the goal of worship, what the object of worship, the subject of worship, and all those things, and trying to look to see whether particular types of worship deal with those things well or not. And to study worship separate from those things leads to an emptiness where you can say things like particular texts are merely scripts, like you would have on a stage, and you have to breathe life in. Whereas I think we would agree that the purpose of worship for a Christian is not to breathe life into words, into scripts, because the words, of course, that we're using in worship are words of praise, often words directly from Scripture that already have the life in them, comes from the fact that they are God's revelation to us. And so we miss out on that piece of it. And since this book is designed in a way that is mostly about being early 21st century systematic theology. It is disappointing when a chapter really seems to not be adding to that goal. And so I appreciate that. Now, again, there are some things that we can take from them. We may use theories of how language works, how various pieces of liturgy might fit together to look at whether certain worship, certain ways of worship, whether certain methods of worship actually meet the, as we would say, the regulative principle of worship. Do they meet the commands of God? Are they doing what worship is supposed to do? And so there's a role for those kinds of things. But unfortunately, I think here the task is it's missing sort of that basic understanding of what is the real purpose of what is the theology of worship, and we get more into just simply a practice of worship and a comparison of practices of worship without really thinking through some of those theological issues. And even at the end, where it was interesting that there was a discussion of some things that are going on as a result of the 20th century liturgical movement that I think are true. We're seeing, I think, more frequent celebrations of communion in a lot of congregations, including Reformed congregations. There's a lot more focus, I think, on weekly or at least more regular communion in those congregations, and that may be some impact of this liturgical movement. But if we're only describing and we're not then taking that description and applying it to determine whether the worship that we're doing is what God commands of us, what God wants of us, then what's the reason even for doing it? So yeah, again, I know that you may be a little concerned that you're being unfair to Professor Spinks here. And it may be that in some ways what we would like to see out of this chapter wasn't at all what Professor Spinks was trying to get at. And there's some truth to that as well. But all that is to say that I think for a Reformed person coming to this chapter and looking for some real deep dives into theology of worship, we're not going to be particularly well served in this chapter. There are issues that are interesting, but this is really not the kind of systematic theology that we would want to use to help guide our churches how to worship.
Thank you for that, Chuck. I think I wanted to just contrast this chapter with some content from just one particular Reformed treatment. And so I have private notes of the Doctrine of the Church from Reformed Baptist pastor Greg Nichols from his Doctrine of the Church volume in his Systematic Theology. It's not publicly published yet. It's privately published, and I'm very fortunate to have a copy of that. And one of the things he does in his consideration of what worship is about in the church is the first thing he makes, and I think one of the most mature distinctions that can be made at an ecumenical level. This is not just a Calvinist only or a Protestant only or a Latin tradition only or a Greek Orthodox only claim. I think one of the most important distinctions is the distinction between elements of worship and the circumstances of worship. So that is to say, and we talked about this, I think, the last chapter. There are some essential things that are distinctives, that are always to be observed, always to be a part of the regular worship of a local church. And then there are incidental things that matter in terms of the logistics of worship, and yet in some ultimate sense are not essential like the essential elements are. And so Pastor Nichols talks about that. He makes that distinction. On top of that, he then gives 6 essential elements associated with proper worship. And so the first, and in his mind, primary element of worship is that worship should involve the prayer of the church, the gathered body of the saints, reaching up to God in prayer, calling on his name, as it were. There's an appropriate content of prayer. There are ways to pray that are edifying and positive. And then there are ways of praying that are performative. And I don't mean to necessarily say that in an exclusive or sense, but this idea that ultimately the people have gathered to worship God as opposed to experience entertainment or a performance. And maybe that's not fair to put Professor Spinks as saying worship is only performance or entertainment. But so the first essential element is prayer. The second essential element he lists is the reading of the scriptures. So God's word being heard publicly by the people. Ideally, the reading and the associated explanations is done by someone who is facile in the process. Typically, that's a trained seminarian. It doesn't have to be, but that's the good idea of you want somebody competent doing this. Then you have the next element, which is the preaching and the hearing of God's word. So after the reading of the scriptures, there's that gap that the pastor who gives a sermon tries to make when he takes his audience from the scriptures that were read, and then he leads them to a place that he hopes and prays and asks the Lord to bless, that it would be edifying. And so this would be ideas of application, ideas of ethics. The next element that Pastor Nichols lists is singing. And we have this famous passage from the scriptures teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And so what do God's people do when they come together? They've got a lot of singing to do. Why? Because praise, even as Professor Spinks talks about here correctly, praise is such an integral part of worship. This is a saved people reaching up to God with the fruits of their praise. Now, finally, the last two elements that he lists. The first one is the ordinances of the church. Now, that opens up a whole issue of sacramental theology, which we're not going to open that can here. But just the idea that there are some administrations that need to happen. There are ordinances that, or sacraments that are used and ordained by God as a means to convey grace. And then finally, we have this special occasions or special situations. And so think of here things like fasting, private times where the church gathers together to specially plead with God. That's not the normal sort of worship situation. So we think of this idea of solemn humiliation, fastings, thanksgiving, special occasions. In the Old Testament, there are a lot of commands given by the Lord to the nation of Israel to celebrate this holiday, to get ready, prepare, and be in the position to return God thanks for this blessing or for that blessing. As well as there are special occasions of tragedy where the people are called upon to fast and pray, occasions of danger and peril where the fasting and prayer is to direct the Lord to move in the face of that clear and present danger. And so those were the kinds of things that I was looking for. And even I don't believe that ecumenicism is so disparate that we couldn't talk about essential elements with anyone in either Eastern Orthodox forms of Christianity, Roman Catholicism, even in our own pool in the Protestant section, Chuck. I think this would be the kind of thing that I would expect to be in a systematic theology. And not having that in there, I think, makes the professor's treatment for the poor. So there's a lot more to be said here. And I think it'll probably come out in other contexts and in other places. And there was, by the way, there was a lot of interesting, edifying material that we could go through here. I loved the historical development the professor put in. I loved considering what other traditions thought, what even the modern developments are relevant and interesting to think about. So I didn't want this to just be completely negative, but you helped me bring some balance to that, and I very much appreciate that, Chuck. So are there any sort of final thoughts for this session that you are moved that you want to make sure we mention?
First of all, I appreciate your bringing out those sort of 6 elements of worship. I think that that's helpful to think through those things. And I would agree that there is a sense, whether even if there is a sense in which, we're missing one or one of those doesn't need to be there or whatever, it would have been nice to have that kind of a basic discussion here in worship. And some of the issues that have come up historically, as you said, the Sphinx does do a nice job of kind of walking through some of the historical patterns and points out that we don't know a whole lot about how worship was done prior to the 4th century, but then looks at different eras of the church and what was done. But even then, it would be nice to be able to use a framework like that, elements versus accidents, that it would be nice to have that kind of a framework to talk about some of the issues that have come up in the history of the church. We have the history, which I don't think really even got mentioned at all of issues about images and things like that, and iconoclasm that actually occurred in the Eastern Church, but then was defeated, but yet was a little stronger in the Western Church. And of course, during the Reformation, of course, iconoclasm, was certainly the result of certain views of the regulative principle of worship. And we don't really get into that. We don't get into issues of why we might. You mentioned, and we're not going to get into that, some of the issues of sacramentalism, and even the choice of a term like ordinance is meaningful there. But those kinds of issues could have been addressed in this chapter and weren't, because the basics behind it weren't there to be discussed. And this is almost one of those things where I almost feel like I feel bad that some of these issues just don't get discussed. And so even a more ecumenical view, if I remember, I think I've mentioned my daughter went to a Missouri Synod Lutheran high school. She sang in the school's choir and would often go sing for worship services, but also a lot of times the concerts were held in local Lutheran churches. And a good friend of mine, another Reformed guy, decided to send his daughter as well to that school. And I remember going to a concert and seeing him there, and his late mother came to the concert. And this was a woman that I knew fairly well because she was pretty close friends with my grandmother. And I remember she was just looking up. She was raised in the Reformed tradition, very much in the Reformed tradition, and very specific ways of worship. And so she was rather taken aback when she walked into this very ornate and beautiful Lutheran church with a crucifix up front. And why do they even do that? And we don't get to have those kind of discussions here because in the end, those key factors that might help us to have that, and even to have a fair discussion, let's say maybe someone from the Lutheran tradition on one side. This chapter doesn't lay the foundation for that discussion. So in that way, it is somewhat disappointing. But as you pointed out, there's some neat stuff in here too. So I wouldn't, if somebody is already reading the book and they were planning on reading the whole book anyway, I wouldn't tell them to skip this chapter. Don't skip the chapter. There's nothing good in there. No, that's not true. There's some things to be learned in here. But yes, it was both in terms of what it could have covered and in terms of how much we can get out of it. Sadly, I have to say it was perhaps one of the weaker chapters that I've read thus far between the ones that you and I have discussed, and I've also read a few of the other chapters in the book thus far. Sad to say, but it was good to have the discussion because I think, rather than just say, oh, it was a weak chapter, it was good to talk about the reasons why we thought it might have been and what could have made it better. And even some of that discussion about worship, I think, is very useful to have. And so I'm glad that, I guess what I should say is that I'm glad that we got to have a discussion about a chapter that we thought was weak, because we also got to discuss why we thought it was weak and what could have been done better, and then get at some of these issues. Thanks be to God, even for weakly written chapters.